So I've talked a lot about mastery-based learning. In my Intellectual Ancestors video a couple weeks ago, I even talked about how Mastery Collaborative has been a huge part of kind of how I envision grading. Now, I recently listened to a podcast where someone kind of changed my thinking with just a quick, a sentence. And I kept exploring this person's website for okay, where does this exist? And I think it exists somewhere, and I will link to this in the notes too. But really, I was like, well, what it looks like in K-12 practice, how I envisioned it, how I heard it was different from, I think, what this individual and their organization does. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to run with this. So it is the idea of, instead of mastery-based learning and having these categories of mastery around a particular standard, thinking of them as learning progressions or sequences of standards. So I've talked before about priority standards and kind of the stepping stone standards or the supporting standards that support the priority standards, because you got to choose some to be priority, right? And what happens to the others? They become supporting. I think if we use these instead of just naming them supporting and then they kind of fall off the radar, what if we specifically laid out the sequence with which students can learn and build upon each of those supporting standards to ultimately get to the priority standard, and then the priority standard becomes the excellent or whatever category of mastery that historically you've had. So I am going to pull up my rubrics doc that I have shared historically, and I'm going to show you how I've transformed it to be more in line with this new way of thinking. So let's take a look. Here is my rubric template. Typically, it has looked like this: proficiency-based or mastery-based. I still think that the bicycle metaphor, or whatever metaphor you use, still works, and you just don't necessarily need a category for it. And you could also just completely remove this row, but I think learning sequence, and you could have maybe a theme of each learning sequence or something. You can even name it after the priority standard if you want. But one thing that I'm thinking, let's just do an example. Here we go. So you've kind of building the supporting standards. So let's say that this one is, our priority standard is going to be analysis. It's the hardest thing, hands down, that we've had. So you could describe it. What does it look like? But that's the priority standard. So backwards mapping from there. Okay. So before we analyze, we have to be able to comprehend, right? Or no, we have to summarize. We have to be able to regurgitate back. Here is the gist of what I read, right? And it could be from a bunch of different sources, but then we're going to bring it together and analyze it with a critical lens, right? That's the ultimate. We got to summarize first. That is a prerequisite to analysis, right? So summarize, analyze, you can make these align grammatically, but summarize, analyze. Prior to summarizing, we need to be able to have comprehension. So we have to comprehend. And comprehension includes a lot of things. It includes things like vocabulary, which we could put here. I think even more, depending on the grade level, you may say that this is actually decoding, right? Or depending even on not even the grade level, but your student's reading level, perhaps. It could also be vocabulary. It could be decoding and vocabulary. It could be anything else that you come up with here. But I think generally speaking, we can decode, we can have a big enough sense of being able to say the words, understand the words' meanings, then we comprehend larger paragraphs and texts. Then we can summarize it, and then we can analyze, right? So this is just one example of what this could look like. But I think it would be really helpful to go through all your priority standards and think about what are the sequence of skills, right? What's kind of the next step for a student who's struggling? And it's well, yeah, I know I'm not at the place that I need to be for analysis, but what's the next thing that I can do? And it feels more accessible. I also would encourage people to think about, how does our definition of this and considering a learning sequence for someone who comes in beginning of the year, they're a really good analyzer. What does it look like to go from there? Again, considering this idea of a learning sequence. So maybe we play with this idea a little bit more. Maybe there is no final category. Maybe this just goes on and on, or maybe students co-create it with you as you kind of put it out there. But maybe it's never ending, which also helps people feel like they haven't, that there is this place they need to end up, and that they are just on their journey, and that's totally fine. Maybe each student makes up their own learning sequence with support and guidance from you. But I think this would be really cool to do as an exercise for a department. What does your learning sequence look like for all of your core skills in this department? So we just went through a bunch of possibilities of what you could do and what that might look like, but I would love to hear from you. I'm going to link that template in the description below, but I'd love to hear how you're using it and playing with it, because I think this is still in its infancy in my brain. So I'd love to hear what you think around how it might be best used and what it could actually look like. And if you have finished products, please share them with me, drop them in the comments, share them with me via email or on social.